Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Let me set the stage. It was late 1981, and Marvel Comics decided it needed to shake things up with Spider-Man. Writer Roger Stern decided that what would help would be introducing a new villain, and he ended up having a hit on his hands when he introduced the Hobgoblin. This villain was powerful, he was calculating, and perhaps most importantly, his true identity was shrouded in mystery. But unfortunately, this is the story of how editorial interference led to the eventual reveal of that identity, landing with a thud. This is the story of writers and editors not trusting one another. It's a total fiasco, and readers at the time may not have been privy to the behind-the-scenes drama, but now we can look back with hindsight and the advantage of modern-day interviews to piece together this complete mess. Today, let's take a look at the story of the Hobgoblin. The Spider-Man title sold well in 1981, but it had been steadily declining since it launched in 1962, minus the occasional spurt for a big event. For instance, the recent edition of his black costume was a hit, but numbers had steadily declined from around 340,000 copies a month when the title launched to about 242,000 copies a month in 1981. Writer Roger Stern had been doing well on Spider-Man's secondary title, Spectacular Spider-Man, and editor Tom DeFalco moved him up to the main book, Amazing Spider-Man. One thing Stern did which resonated well was adding a brand new villain, Hobgoblin. Most of Spider-Man's classic enemies had been created by Steve Ditko with Stan Lee, and a handful more were created throughout the 60s when artist John Romita stepped in. But after Stan Lee left, there weren't as many iconic villains created. There was Morbius, arguably, in 1971, Hammerhead in 1972, Punisher in 1974, and maybe Black Cat in 1979, but mostly stories reused classic villains. One thing Roger Stern did with his writing was not rely on what had been done before. Vulture was the only classic villain that he used, opting to create new threats that pushed Spider-Man in new ways. There were new characters, but the tone was the same. Maybe a bit less dialogue than the Stan Lee days, but consistent with those stories. Stern was the bridge between Silver Age Spider-Man and the modern age, faithful to characterization and use of the supporting cast. He refocused Peter Parker's life on his work at the Daily Bugle. Among the cast of characters there, aside from stalwarts like J. Jonah Jameson, Peter's grouchy publisher who despises Spider-Man, Stern used reporter Ned Leeds. Ned will play an important part in Hobgoblin's story later on, so remember that name. Ned was created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko back in 1964's issue 18 of Amazing Spider-Man. In the comics, Ned was a good journalist, and eventually married Peter's first crush, Betty Brant. In the current Marvel Cinematic Universe, Ned Leeds is the best friend of Peter Parker, though his look and personality is largely based on the character of Ganke Lee, who is the best friend of the Miles Morales Spider-Man. Stern helped Peter evolve. He was still an everyman who was always on the back foot with work and personal life challenges, but someone who was now fully committed to the hero life. In Spectacular Spider-Man, Stern began writing on the title in 1982 and created several new supporting characters, but one I want you to remember for later is Roderick Kingsley, who is an amoral businessman in the fashion industry. Among Stern's classic stories were A Battle Against the Unstoppable Juggernaut and the tearjerker The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man. However, his lasting contribution is likely the creation of villain Hobgoblin, along with artist John Romita Jr. So first, what I'd like to do is describe to you some of the important elements of Hobgoblin's origin and his early stories, and then we'll be able to talk about the behind-the-scenes drama about the creation of this character. Issue 238 of Amazing Spider-Man features a common crook on the run from Spider-Man, who loses the hero in some sewer tunnels. By chance, he comes across an old hideout of Spider-Man's late enemy, the Green Goblin. The criminal opts to sell the information and access to the gear and journals of Norman Osborn's Green Goblin to a mystery buyer. The mystery buyer even kills this common crook to cover his tracks. Stern was dedicated to keeping the true identity of Hobgoblin a mystery, with his goal being to keep it a secret for 26 issues, one longer than the Stan Lee original Green Goblin mystery. Stern never got to see that to completion. However, he did tell some great stories with this new adversary, and while he may have modified Green Goblin's gear, this enemy was very different. Green Goblin had been driven mad by his goblin serum. The Hobgoblin was very much sane, more calculating and careful, and Stern knew who was behind the mask. Issue 239 features the first confrontation between Hobgoblin and Spider-Man. Hobgoblin had been raiding more of Osborn's storehouses for gear and supplies, maybe journals, which attract Spider-Man's attention, and they come to blows. Hobgoblin has upgraded the technology he has at hand, but Spider-Man still gets the upper hand. As Spider-Man moves to unmask him, we hear Hobgoblin think about how he must not be unmasked, for the disgrace would be too great. This panel, along with a page of the mysterious man behind the mask shown to the reader only in silhouette, piqued readers' interest. Hobgoblin wisely retreats from battle, realizing he is exhausted, and there must have been more to Green Goblin than just the technology in order to physically go toe-to-toe with Spider-Man. Hobgoblin returned in issues 244 and 245. More of Osborn's company warehouses are being robbed, and Spider-Man tracks the robbers down and begins fighting them. However, a man in black uses a pumpkin bomb to start a fire and attacks Spider-Man with Hobgoblin's new razor bats before driving away in a truck. Spider-Man stays behind to save the criminals from the fire. The man in black shows up at a motel where Hobgoblin is recovering. The man in black was merely one of Hobgoblin's minions, Lefty Donovan, and the men who had been used as robbers were used as a distraction so that Lefty could steal chemicals. The following issue is the first of 3 covers to promise to unmask the Hobgoblin. Marvel teased the readers with this a lot, but it worked. The second of this 2-parter story shows a mystery man mixing the chemicals obtained in the previous issue, putting together the Goblin serum from Osborn's old journals. They explode in his face, and a second man drags him out of the house, which is caught on fire. The house then explodes with the second man inside. The mystery man lies in a hospital bandaged for weeks. Meanwhile, Peter Parker sorts out his life and commits to being a freelance photographer full-time, planning to continue his graduate studies in the future. His friends and co-workers Betty and Ned Leeds warn him that his new path may be tougher than he thinks. The man in the hospital awakens and escapes, suiting up as the Hobgoblin. He flies to Times Square and begins to cause chaos. Spider-Man shows up and has a much tougher time because Hobgoblin now has super strength. Still, Spider-Man subdues and unmasks the Hobgoblin, only to realize it's minor criminal Lefty Donovan. Before Spider-Man can learn more, Donovan's Hobgoblin gear explodes, killing him. In a coda to the issue, we see that the real Hobgoblin was monitoring everything to see how the Goblin serum would affect someone. He's not prepared to take it himself until it's refined to keep him sane. His plot had the added bonus of making it seem that the Hobgoblin is dead. Stern's final Hobgoblin arc took place in issues 249 through 251. In these issues, wealthy men are summoned to an exclusive club by a mysterious man blackmailing them. Among those summoned are Peter's best friend Harry Osborn, boss J. Jonah Jameson, and fashion mogul Roderick Kingsley. Also showing up uninvited is Wilson Fisk, the kingpin of crime in New York. Hobgoblin appears and threatens to uncover the men's secrets unless they pay him a modest recurring fee. But when Harry lashes out at Hobgoblin, it's revealed that the man they've all been talking to was just a simple animatronic. The real Hobgoblin crashes in to take over, but Spider-Man is right behind him and they fight. This time, the Hobgoblin wins the fight and is about to kill Spider-Man, but he is saved from a killing blow by Kingpin of all people. Hobgoblin escapes because he doesn't want to confront Kingpin and his men. Kingpin tells Spider-Man that he does not want to deal with Hobgoblin and placed one of Spider-Man's tracers on Hobgoblin. It allows Spider-Man to track down the Hobgoblin and they continue their battle. In the fight, Norman Osborn's journals are burnt up to Hobgoblin's fear and rage. With nothing of value left at his hideout, the Hobgoblin escapes in a tricked-out van, battling Spidey until they crash off a dock into the river. Spider-Man escapes the sinking vehicle and it explodes, with Spidey finding Hobgoblin's mask, but no body. These 3 Hobgoblin story arcs were all that Roger Stern wrote for the character in Amazing Spider-Man, however. He was planning to eventually reveal who was behind Hobgoblin's mask, but he ended up quitting the title because he didn't get along with his new editor. Originally, Roger Stern was getting along very well with his editor, Tom DeFalco. However, Danny Fingeroth was placed as the new editor on the Spider-Man titles, and the two just butted heads. Roger Stern decided to quit before he could reveal who was behind Hobgoblin's mask. Stern built up not just the mystery behind Hobgoblin, but his menace. Hobgoblin got a clean win in a fight against Spider-Man in his last appearance by Stern, and before that showed that he was more than willing to use and sacrifice henchmen to lower the risk to himself. Stern's plan was to reveal that the Hobgoblin was Roderick Kingsley. However, he hadn't laid too much of the groundwork before he left. One small example of his plan is a fleeting mention in issue 250 where Kingsley wonders where his brother was. Stern intended for Roderick to have a look-alike brother, though not a twin, that he would use as a double for him when he appeared as the Hobgoblin. Stern explained his idea saying, quote, "Roderick was a manipulator, a totally amoral businessman who used people and then tossed them to the side. As I was scripting Amazing Spider-Man number 238, I realized that the voice I was developing for the man who was about to become the Hobgoblin was the same as Kingsley's voice. That was when I realized that he was my ideal choice," end quote. But what Stern hadn't counted on was butting heads with editor Danny Fingeroth. Stern spoke about it, saying, quote, "As far as Spider-Man was concerned, Tom and I were absolutely on the same wavelength. When he left, it just wasn't the same without him. I didn't have to explain every little detail to Tom the way I did with Danny. I could see that if we kept working together, it would drive at least one of us crazy, maybe both of us. After about 6 months, I called John Romita Jr. to discuss it with him, and he said he was thinking of leaving Amazing to spend more time on the X-Men, and that made it easier to leave the book," end quote. And so Danny Fingeroth placed Tom DeFalco, previously an editor for Amazing Spider-Man, on the book as the new writer. Tom DeFalco knew what Roger Stern's plan was for revealing Roderick Kingsley behind the Hobgoblin, but he didn't really like that idea. He didn't like the idea of an identical brother that wasn't even a twin, and he had his own plan that he began to lay out for who would be behind the Hobgoblin's mask. DeFalco's writing on Spider-Man focused on street crime, using villains like Kingpin, Hammerhead, and a new player, the Rose. The Rose and Hobgoblin team up for much of DeFalco's run, working to take down the other players in organized crime. The Rose wore a simple purple mask. Editor Tom Brevoort wrote about DeFalco's plans for the Rose, saying, quote, "Tom basically said that he had conceived the Rose to be essentially a middle management crime figure because he thought there'd have to be characters like that. And when he started writing him, he didn't have any particular secret identity. It wasn't a mystery he was deliberately building. But then, when the readers grabbed onto it in the ripple effect of the Hobgoblin identity mystery, Tom says that he decided he needed to make the Rose some known character, and he settled on Roderick Kingsley, who was in the series at the time. But the Rose's identity didn't get revealed until Tom was off the book, so it wound up being somebody else," end quote. Ironically, DeFalco planned to reveal the Hobgoblin as Richard Fisk, the son of the Kingpin. But later, when the next writer on Spider-Man revealed who the Rose was, it was he who was Richard Fisk. The Hobgoblin's identity still hadn't been revealed. From issues 259 through 261, we see Hobgoblin and Rose form a new partnership, as well as Hobgoblin kidnapping Harry Osborn's wife and Mary Jane Watson. Hobgoblin tries to use this leverage to blackmail Harry Osborn into obtaining more journals. He ultimately does obtain a single one, but Spider-Man saves everyone, and Hobgoblin learns the information inside the journal is redundant. He then pledges to forget about the journals and forge his own path forward. DeFalco used Hobgoblin for a second story, a two-parter across issues 275 and 276. This time around, Hobgoblin has some new weaponry and goes up against Spider-Man, gaining a decisive win. Spider-Man is in his black suit, but it's cloth, not the Venom symbiote, just to be clear. In the second issue, Spider-Man recovers, and in a fight, he covers the Goblin's face in webbing. The Hobgoblin rips off his mask and flees into a warehouse with Spider-Man right behind. Spider-Man dives through the flooring and nabs an unconscious Hobgoblin, only to pull off the mask to see the face of his old friend Flash Thompson underneath. Of course, the end of the story shows us that the real Hobgoblin is still out there, and he simply framed Flash to keep the heat off of himself. It's worth noting that the editors on the Spider-Man titles had been reassigned again for these issues and moving forward. DeFalco was now being edited by Jim Owsley, today known as Christopher Priest. Priest was only 22 years old, placed in a position editing DeFalco, who had been a senior editor and writer at Marvel for years. The thinking was probably that the Spider titles were in the hands of seasoned pros, so the editor just needed to guide things. Priest has never spoken about this tumultuous time in interviews, but he did write about it obliquely in his own blog. One thing he said was that, quote, "It was criminally stupid to have a 22-year-old neophyte editor edit his own boss," end quote. He also said, quote, "If I had to do it over again, I would never have accepted the appointment as editor of the Spider-Man franchise. I made a lot of mistakes. I hurt a lot of people. I lost a lot of friends. It's a difficult thing for me to discuss," end quote. And now we enter the final act of this story where Hobgoblin's identity will be revealed. It gets ugly at this point. It seems like a lot of feelings were hurt, a lot of friendships were ended, a lot of the people that were involved in the Spider-Man books at this time are very angry with one another. It's pretty sad. It seems to involve some deliberate sabotage against at least one person, according to everyone else that was involved in the books at the time. The next Hobgoblin story is a 5-part story about a gang war across organized crime figures in New York, including Hobgoblin and the Rose, Kingpin, and Hammerhead, among others. Issues 284 and 285 give DeFalco a plotting credit, but Priest himself took over scripting duties and writes the final 3 issues, credited as Jim Owsley. At the same time, Priest wrote a Spider-Man one-shot, Spider-Man vs. Wolverine, that takes place just after these 5 issues, but before the following monthly issue of Amazing Spider-Man. He did this quietly without telling any of the other writers on the Spider-Man books. The specifics of Hobgoblin's actions and characterization this time around are not as important as what happened behind the scenes, because editor Priest decided to sabotage Tom DeFalco's stated goal of revealing the Hobgoblin. The writers of the Spider-Man books went to a retreat, and Priest asked DeFalco point-blank who was behind Hobgoblin's mask. DeFalco stated that it was going to be Ned Leeds, Peter Parker's co-worker at the Daily Bugle. And ultimately, that's what Christopher Priest wrote. He killed off Ned Leeds in the Spider-Man vs. Wolverine comic, and then had Ned Leeds revealed as the Hobgoblin in issue 289, which he assigned Peter David to write. Priest also had DeFalco and Frenz fired off of the Spider-Man title immediately before the one-shot issue with Wolverine was released. In actuality, DeFalco, of course, planned to reveal that Richard Fisk was the man behind Hobgoblin, but he never got his opportunity because Christopher Priest believed that it was intended to be Ned Leeds, and that's what he wrote, and that's what became canon at the time. It was a total mess. Priest also ended up revealing the Rose's identity, and for that he used Richard Fisk. None of these writers were using Roderick Kingsley. In 2009, back issue number 35 interviewed the parties involved on the Spider-Man titles at that time to clear up what had happened. Priest did not comment. Peter David had been writing Spectacular Spider-Man and was hired to write Amazing Spider-Man starting with issue 289, directly after the Gang War storyline, trying to retroactively explain the Ned Leeds reveal. He ultimately told the story of Ned Leeds being surprised and overpowered by the assassins, while simultaneously unveiling Hobgoblin again. This time, it wasn't a mystery, it was mercenary Jason Massendale who took over the empty suit, having been in the title for quite a while as second-string villain Jack-O-Lantern. David summarized what went down behind the scenes, saying, quote, Owsley comes into my office, I was working at Marvel in the direct sales department at the time, and he says, we're going to go out for lunch and discuss who the Hobgoblin is going to be. And I said, what are you talking about? The Hobgoblin is Ned Leeds. And he said, no, he's not Ned Leeds. And I said, what do you mean? We all discussed this at the writers' conference. And those are the stories that Tom has been writing. And Owsley says, Tom's not doing the book anymore, and it's not going to be Ned Leeds, and I'm going to tell you who it's going to be. So, we went out to lunch, and Owsley reveals to me that he's killing off Ned Leeds in Spider-Man vs. Wolverine one-shot. And I said, what the bleep do you mean? Ned Leeds is the Hobgoblin. And he said, no. And I said, why are you doing this? And Owsley said, to piss off DeFalco. And I said, well, that's kind of juvenile. Look, you've got to rethink this. And he said, it's already drawn. DeFalco commented on being let go, saying, quote, Owsley killed off Ned to screw up my continuity. Then he decided to fire me instead. He thought he'd throw me a curveball by killing off Ned. I would have been annoyed about it, but it wouldn't have been a curveball for me because I never intended for the Hobgoblin to be Ned anyway. I just knew I couldn't trust Owsley, and this proved it. On Priest's blog post, he strangely wrote that at the time, quote, suddenly Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin, a move that infuriated Roger Stern, but one that I had absolutely nothing to do with, end quote. In that issue of Back Issue, Stern, DeFalco, and David all replied to this. Stern commented, quote, I wasn't infuriated at all. I saw it as an opportunity. I realized that the stuff established in number 289 could serve as the foundation for a whole new story, end quote. DeFalco and David both point out that they don't see how Priest could have had nothing to do with it since he was the editor at the time. And so Peter David retroactively told a story that explained how Ned Leeds had become the Hobgoblin. He said, quote, I was satisfied with what I wrote because I was thrust into a situation that I absolutely could not win. It's the most insane project I've ever been involved with. It was a story that I did because there was absolutely no other way to do it, end quote. Meanwhile, Priest wrote 2 issues of Web of Spider-Man to explain more backstory on Ned Leeds. Apparently, as Ned Leeds worked on his story to take down the Kingpin, he got so mad that he decided to turn to crime to get revenge on Kingpin, as well as teaming up with the Kingpin's son to do it. I'll be honest, I see that motivation as kind of weak, and I also never really saw Ned Leeds as having the charismatic personality that the Hobgoblin clearly does. On top of that, I don't understand how Ned Leeds had the money that Hobgoblin clearly does, because Hobgoblin buys information, he hires henchmen, he upgrades equipment, something I don't understand how Ned Leeds could have. Plus, Ned Leeds was married with a full-time job. It just didn't make sense to me. It fell flat for me as a reader at the time. I think it fell flat for a lot of readers at the time. And at this point, I don't think Hobgoblin ever recovered to become a top-tier villain ever again. The best I can say about this time is that overall things improved moving forward. And the single issue of Spider-Man vs. Wolverine in a vacuum is a cool Cold War espionage story. It's just that Ned Leeds reveal in the middle that comes out of left field and does not connect at all. The 5-part gang war story also features the first issue of Spider-Man that Eric Larson ever illustrated. In general, all of the issues with Hobgoblin have strong artwork. The early stuff with Stern had the writer paired with John Romita Jr. in his early days, and you can witness the artist grow from a solid but generic Marvel style into his own confident artwork. There are some covers by Mike Zeck that look great too. But what made Hobgoblin cool was mostly from the first man to write him, Roger Stern. He made Hobgoblin a schemer, a manipulator, someone quite a bit different from Green Goblin. The mystery of his identity captured the reader's imaginations, and if you go back, you'll see speculation across the letters pages of the book. Over a decade later, Marvel let Roger Stern write a mini-series called Hobgoblin Lives. It retroactively explains that Roderick Kingsley was the original Hobgoblin and that he had brainwashed Ned Leeds into thinking that he was Hobgoblin. That does seem like a trick Hobgoblin would employ since he'd used devils before. But as to how a fashion mogul was able to reverse engineer the Goblin formula, I couldn't say. Regardless, while it makes a lot more sense than Ned Leeds, it was just too many years removed from the original story to make many waves with readers. In the mid-'80s, when Hobgoblin was created, the mystery identity was definitely a cool element of his character. But ultimately, that wasn't the only thing that made him cool. He was Hobgoblin. Yes, he was mysterious, but he was also confident, he was charismatic, he was cunning, and he was very capable. And ultimately, that was more than enough. Thank you so much for watching this episode. I'm going to be back next week with my year-end wrap-up, telling you what I thought the best books of 2021 were. I am now trying to make YouTube a full-time thing, so if you want to support that for as little as $1, please consider hitting the link in the description below to check out my Patreon. That would mean a lot. And until I see you next time, keep reading comics. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, there are merchandise links beneath the YouTube video, and you can always hit join on YouTube or visit Comic Tropes on Patreon to get access to special perks.